Okay, so today we will discuss Putin's plan to destroy the American empire. So last class we discussed that Putin loves his country, Russia, and he believes that Western consumerism has corrupted his nation. And he recognizes that the source of Western consumerism is the American empire. So in order to completely free his people, he needs to destroy the empire, okay? And historically, empires die when three things happen concurrently, okay, together. Okay? The first is overextension. And this is the main reason why empires die, when they fight too many wars at once. And the reason why they're overextended is hubris. And what hubris is in military strategy is the idea of blindness. So you are blind to the fact of your own limitations. You are blind to the strategy of your opponents. You are blind to the overall geopolitical picture. Okay? You're just blind. And the example is American strategy nowadays, where America is fighting Russia and Ukraine, where it is fighting Hamas in Israel, and there's a threat of Iran on the horizon. But for whatever reason, most American policymakers believe that the real threat is China.
So that was a clip from a Professor Jiang, a Chinese-born Yale-educated professor. I believe that he teaches somewhere in Canada. The whole video is interesting, so I suggest you check it out. But that excerpt in particular will be the focus of this video. And it begs the all-important question, is President Putin purposely prolonging the Ukraine war? And I ask this not just because of the professor's theory, but having followed the war and made countless videos about it, I often scratch my head as to why the Russian army, which has achieved significant levels of attrition to the tune of 1.7 million based on a released report or hacked report from Ukrainian government sources within the Ukrainian army, to the extent that even in the West, they report of severe manpower shortages, yet the Russian army does not launch a massive offensive to capture Donetsk, which is the most fortified area of Ukraine. Instead, all the reports I read say that the Russian army is launching attacks with small groups of infantry, little to no tanks or mechanized armor. Now, yes, some of this is due to Ukraine's drone technology, which still can inflict casualties and damage on any massive assault operations. But then, we recently saw what happened around Pokrovsk. During the second week of August, the Russian army achieved a surprise breakthrough north of Leningrad, where they advanced rapidly by at least 17, or according to some other sources, 20 kilometers toward a town called Dobropilya that sits deep in the rear of the Ukrainian defense of the key logistical city of Pokrovsk, and threatened to cut off a major supply line that runs from Pokrovsk, or north of Pokrovsk, to the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. But the interesting thing is, barely any Russian sources reported on it at the time. In fact, it was the Ukrainian sources that broke the news. And what's even more strange is that, again, this wasn't a big offensive. Just, like I said before, small groups of infantry that came upon Ukrainian fortifications and realized, and I kid you not, that no one was there. So here's an excerpt from a frontline report from Ukrainian media about the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya breakthrough, in quotations. However, due to a lack of infantry, this defensive line was almost empty and unable to resist, so it partially fell into the hands of the invaders. This occurred despite the fact that the Russians were advancing in small groups of assault troops, which penetrated the Ukrainian intermittent line of defense at night rather than break through it. And that's not all. The situation demonstrated that Ukrainian armed forces have real organizational problems. Otherwise, such a breakthrough would not have happened. This was, the Ukrainian report said, a clear sign of how bad the manpower situation amongst the UAF, or the Ukrainian armed forces, is. Not enough men to man the most important sector of the front line, the defense of Pokrovsk, the last and most important logistics hub in the Donbass, that supplies the last defense line in Donetsk, the Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, Druzhivka agglomeration. Ukraine was forced to pull men from the Sumy front, which is up north, and other fronts to stop the advance. But then, this is where it gets interesting. Russia did not seemingly be too keen on either reporting on the breakthrough or trying to secure it, as they appear to have been lackluster in sending sufficient reinforcements in time and were eventually pushed back, which makes it even more curious. RT News, Russia Today, was one of the few Russian sources that reported on the breakthrough and described it as follows. The Russian advance was met with eerily little resistance. Again, here they say Ukrainian sources exploded with alarm over the rapid Russian advance, but for several days, Russian channels provided neither confirmation nor geolocation. Even now, when this article was reported, no official statements have been made. So what was the thinking? Why the secrecy? And why such little effort to secure their positions with such a breakthrough that had the potential of collapsing Pokrovsk? A breakthrough that even amongst Ukrainian experts, this one in particular, Sergei Gurets, said, in quotations, without capturing Pokrovsk and Leningrad, the enemy cannot advance towards Sloviansk, Kramatorsk agglomeration. Now the rabbit hole gets deeper. Here's a clip from an interview from a favorite YouTube channel of mine called The Real Reporter, an interview with a former Russian commander of an assault unit named Maxim. And what he says here adds to my point.
In your opinion, when could the Russia-Ukraine war actually end?
Best case scenario, end of 2027. Worst case, maybe around 2030. You have to understand, right now Russia is using only the bare minimum of its resources. If the commander-in-chief decided to raise the level of effort even a little bit, even by just 5%, you would immediately start to see the front line shifting. The situation on the map would begin to change very quickly, and the advance of the Russian army would speed up dramatically.
So in summary, Russia is attacking with minimum offensive capability, evidenced not only from the Russian commander's mouth and the Russian sources who speak of attacks with small assault group advances. This is against a Ukrainian army that has such a dire manpower shortage that important sectors of the front collapse in the face of such a limited Russian advance. The question is, why? Is it, as Professor Jiang says, part of an overall strategic plan to stretch out the West by involving it in drawn-out wars to collapse NATO? Or is it for different reasons, as suggested in some pro-Ukrainian and Western articles? And that is where we will begin today's analysis.
Геополитическая игра, которую затеял Запад, входит в решающую.
In this next part, I will canvass several articles on the topic of Russia prolonging this war purposely. And you will see there are many who agree that Putin is indeed prolonging this war. But of course, from the Ukrainian and Western perspective, their claim as to the reason why differs. At the end, you must decide if and why President Putin is purposely dragging out the Ukraine war. But before we do, can I ask that you make sure to subscribe and help grow this small channel. Also consider joining my membership for exclusive combat footage and long-form analysis at the higher tier. Or if you just want to support my work, you can join the lower tier. So this article reads, soldiers returning from local wars have repeatedly become the driving force behind coups. In 1980 in Turkey, in 1974 in Portugal, in 1952 in Egypt, and in 1936 in Spain. Prigozhin's rebellion, they say, is in the same series. He was stopped only by the fact that Prigozhin was more about money than about power. Therefore, the return of the Russian army from the front poses a real threat to Putin's regime. I have a totally different theory about why the Prigozhin march began and ended, and the video is in the channel membership. The article continues, in the conditions of the totalitarian dictatorship built by Putin, without democratic elections, a change of power is possible in only two ways, either as a result of a coup or through the natural death of the ruler. Last week, we learned that Putin plans to live to be 150 years old, transplanting organs and filling himself with Botox up to his ears. 150 years is about 12 presidential terms in Russia. From the perspective of eternity, it's not that much. But this means that of the two options, a military coup looks like the most realistic way to change power in Russia. And every day of this war only increases the probability of such a scenario, as hinted by Reuters sources. So firstly, for some context, what this Ukrainian source is referring to is a recent recorded dialogue picked up allegedly by a hot mic between President Putin and President Xi Jinping at the recent military parade in Beijing. The two presidents allegedly spoke about organ transplants and the prospect of people living until 150 years old. And here's a clip. So the article continues. Already we see how Putin's heroes, having returned to Russia, kill, rape, and maim daily. That is, they continue to do what they did in the war in Ukraine. Their mass return increases the risks not only of a rise in crime, but also of Putin himself losing power. Logically, it is safer for him to keep the orcs, as they call the Russian soldiers, at war than near the Kremlin walls. So this theory is that Putin is prolonging the war because he fears that if there is peace and Russian soldiers return home, they will likely instigate a coup to overthrow him. To me, this is just another iteration of the Russia will collapse narrative that we have heard since 2022. It plays on the long-held Western theory that Putin is an oppressive dictator, that he forces his citizens into a war that they do not wish to fight and are eager to overthrow him. None of this, of course, accords with reality, given that it is Ukraine and not Russia who is forcibly mobilizing its people. Russia did one partial mobilization from its reserves and fights with volunteers who are paid handsomely. And of course, Putin won the last election by a landslide. But what I notice as well is that this theory seems to be merely another copy and paste narrative from Western sources. So this article is from Social Europe. The title again displays its bias: Why Putin Does Not Want Peace in Ukraine. It says that Vladimir Putin does not want peace in Ukraine, but even on the exceptionally favorable terms for Russia that Donald Trump appears prepared to impose upon Ukrainians and Europeans alike. For several weeks now, this reality has become clear to almost all informed observers, except, it would seem, to Donald Trump himself, who continues to conduct himself as though Vladimir Putin were negotiating in good faith. Now again, the faulty premise is that Trump's peace offer to Russia is really exceptionally favorable to Putin, which of course is a mere opinion, and a weak one at that, given that President Putin has long stated the conditions he is willing to negotiate peace on, and Trump's terms, while conciliatory, fall short of Putin's conditions. So the article goes on to give 3 reasons why Putin, as they say, does not want peace. The second one is the carbon copy of the Ukrainian article I read earlier, and is entitled, Peace Would Threaten Putin's Regime Survival. It reads, furthermore, peace would generate serious social and political tensions accompanying the return to civilian life of hundreds of thousands of demobilized veterans. Many suffer from alcoholism or drug addiction and frequently carry untreated communicable diseases, including AIDS, hepatitis C, and tuberculosis. They have witnessed the front line's horrors and experienced the complete absence of moral constraints or rule of law within Russian military ranks. Accounts, they say, of how Russian officers treat their subordinates make for chilling reading. In all these respects, Vladimir Putin possesses compelling incentives to continue the war, regardless of military outcomes on the ground. So here again we see the negative assumptions of what peace would mean for Russia and unsubstantiated claims of Russian officers treating subordinates in a chilling way. What I notice most about these articles is the utter lack of any sources to support these claims. No research, no studies, no interviews, nothing but bald assertions. So unsurprisingly, President Zelensky of Ukraine was quick to parrot this narrative in his article. This is, of course, despite the fact that it was Ukraine who tried to assassinate Putin by sending drones to his helicopter during the last peace talks back in May this year. And therefore, the evidence points to the fact that it is Ukraine who doesn't want peace, and not President Putin, a man who has attended almost all negotiations instigated by President Trump.
46 беспилотно-летательных средств самолетного типа. Обращаю внимание, что интенсивность атаки во время пролета борта Верховного Главнокомандующего на территории Курской области значительно возросла.
Вертолет президента фактически находился в зоне боевых действий.
Да, именно так. Фактически в эпицентре отражения массированного удара противника беспилотно-летательными аппаратами.
So we see the obvious trend here from the West. Blame the failure of peace on Putin and invent a narrative without sources to say that the reason Putin doesn't want peace is because, again, Russia will collapse. This to me is just another way to counter the obvious counter-argument that is now exploding the Western narrative that Russia is losing the war and suffering heavy casualties. And it goes like this: because the citizenry in the West are now logically asking, well, if what you say is true, then why would Putin refuse such a so-called great offer from Trump if he was losing? Or more aptly, why would President Trump make such an offer in the first place if Ukraine was winning? And then this leads people to question, is Russia really suffering 1 million casualties? Newsflash, it isn't. So in my view, they invent this new narrative that Putin doesn't want peace because Russia will collapse. Not if the war continues, as they used to say, but now even if the war ends. The irony is comical, I say. They should just write the articles with the title, Russia is collapsing, if the sun shines or if the rain falls. But let's consider some other perspective. First, some facts for context. Recently, at a meeting with leaders of parliamentary factions in Russia, Putin disclosed that there are more than 700,000 Russian troops on the line of contact in the SMO zone. And this article from Russian media reads, this news is very actively commented on in Ukraine in the sense that Russia manages to maintain the necessary number of troops in the SMO zone without mobilization, while in Ukraine there is a total mobilization and at the same time there is a catastrophic shortage of personnel in the armed forces of Ukraine. So we have a Russian army that's now larger than what they began with. So what does this mean? So here's what this Italian article entitled, Why Does Putin Benefit from Prolonging the War? Says. They say that Putin has more to gain not by quickly ending the conflict, but by prolonging it to advance Russia's strategic goals, particularly in Ukraine. One theory is rising oil prices and distracting allies from Ukraine. It says Putin is playing a long game in Ukraine, which his forces occupied in 2022. He hopes that the commitment of Ukraine's Western allies, who have provided billions in aid and weapons, will begin to weaken. In quotations, a rival crisis to distract Ukraine's allies in the form of a war in the Middle East could provide just that, writes Robert Dover, Professor of Intelligence and National Security at the University of Hull in the United Kingdom. Such a conflict would divert attention, diplomatic energy, and even military resources from Ukraine if Israel were to launch a wrong invasion of Gaza. So this article was back in 2024. Another factor is the price of oil. Russia is heavily dependent on its oil exports to finance its campaign in Ukraine and has acted in concert with Saudi Arabia to cut supplies and raise prices. Therefore, instability in the Middle East, the world's main oil-producing region, could further increase prices. In quotations, as oil prices rise, it allows them to continue spending on weapons production and also helps them cover some budget deficits. Anne-Marie Daly, a policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, told Bloomberg, Russia absolutely gains an advantage from this in the short term. Then they speak about diplomatic efforts. Russia had a peripheral presence in the Middle East after the fall of the Soviet Union. But in recent decades, Putin has restored Russian influence in the region, forging close ties with Iran, intervening in the Syrian civil war to help prop up Bashar al-Assad's dictatorship, and cultivating ties with their rivals. Putin also has friendly relations with both sides of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has refused to criticize Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Russian officials in recent months have met with delegations from Hamas, which he does not consider a terrorist group. This puts Russia in a unique position to have good relations with the governments of implacable regional enemies. And here we have a Ukrainian article from 2023, again from Espresso TV, based on analysis from the Institute of the Study of War, which is a US-based think tank. Putin has been trying to create preconditions for NATO collapse for 2 decades. Putin's decade-long goal is to create conditions under which NATO will undermine its own global power by creating a structurally and ideologically defeated alliance that will not be able to withstand Russia's future goals. And lastly, this article from Global Watch from earlier this year, which gives details suggesting that Russia may be preparing for a war with NATO. Moscow plans to send up to 100,000 troops to Belarus this year under the guise of holding training exercises, according to Ukrainian intelligence agencies, but many are interpreting the move as possible preparation for an attack on European countries. Also, the Russian military added 140,000 to its ranks in 2024 and plans to add another 150,000 men in 2025, Zelensky said, citing Ukrainian intelligence. And lastly, this is a conclusion from an article from the US think tank United States Institute of Peace. Russian actions in Ukraine and at home in its international relations indicate that Putin is prepared for war over the long haul. He is content to grind away at the Ukrainian forces moving mere kilometers at a time because he believes that he can outlast the West. He is undoubtedly emboldened by debates in the West over the utility of continued military and financial aid for Ukraine and by the shift of international attention to the war in Gaza. So most agree that Russia is prepared for the long haul in Ukraine, and most agree he plans to collapse or weaken NATO via the Ukraine war, as well as through conflicts in the Middle East. What is conveniently left out in many of these Western assessments, however, is that by virtue of this Ukraine war, most of Europe has emptied their stockpiles. This was reported in the Financial Times, interviewing the CEO of Rheinmetall, Armin Papager. And then I will leave you with this article that was published in 2023, shortly after the Hamas invasion into Gaza. Now, how many of you knew that October 7th is also Putin's birthday, and that the Hamas invasion was dubbed by some as a birthday gift to Putin? So what do you think? Is Professor Zhang right? Is this part of Putin's grand strategic plan to collapse NATO and the West via prolonging the Ukraine war and overextending the US and its allies? Or is it, as the Ukrainians now claim, because he is afraid of the consequences of peace on the Russian society? And does what happened at Pokrovsk send a signal that Putin could have done more but restrained his forces because he knows if Pokrovsk collapses, then so goes the Donbass, and so goes the likely conclusion of this war?